We've heard the US ambassador say that the deployment of Marines here is not about China, about the rise of China. What do you think about that?
I think that's both true and also wrong. It is true in the sense that the 2,500 Marines in Darwin are not directly related to any disposition of Chinese forces, for example, in the region. They're not here directly to confront China. But the overall US reorientation and re-engagement in a military sense with Southeast Asia is about the rise of China and about the Chinese behavior, in particular in the South China Sea and the regional concerns that has raised.
In a recent US Congressional Research Service paper on the focus in this region, the authors noted the perception that, quote, a failure to put more emphasis on the Asia-Pacific region could invite other regional powers, particularly China, to shape the region in ways that are not necessarily in US interests. Therefore, how much would that motivation be driving what we're seeing being played out with these Marines in the top end?
I think that is very much the motivation. Obviously, the rise of China is changing the power balances within Asia, and so far the US had most of its forces stationed in Northeast Asia, but that is a region where the US allies, in particular Korea and Japan, themselves are fairly robust, large economies, large military might that can, in a sense, stand up to China in their own region. Southeast Asia is different. The US had significantly reduced its military presence in Southeast Asia after the closure of the bases in the Philippines at the end of the Cold War. Most Southeast Asian countries are far significantly smaller economically, militarily than China, and there was significant concern about Chinese claims, for example, in the South China Sea, Chinese interference in the view of the US with international shipping in the South China Sea. And I think the US engagement in this region is a way of reassuring regional countries in Southeast Asia that the US takes a keen interest and that they're ultimately not alone, if you want, in facing the general reorganization of the region.
Further to that, why Darwin then, given that the US military already has a substantial presence in the northern part of the region, in two of the countries you just mentioned, Korea, Japan, as well as Guam, what does Darwin and Northern Australia offer that can't, and why is it such a good focal point for Southeast Asia?
I think there are a number of reasons why Darwin is an attractive destination for the US. First of all, there are military training areas close by, which is something that in Northeast Asia has been a source of constant tension. If you look at, for example, the constant dispute over the presence of the US Marines in Okinawa. Darwin is obviously also located in Australia, which is a close ally where Australia and the US forces have a history of working together. And then Darwin can be in the mid and longer term a base for engaging with regional militaries. And I think that when you look at the recent ministerial discussions between Australia and Indonesia, you already had those kinds of issues coming up about using the US presence in the region for trilateral exercises, for the disaster relief exercises and similar things. The presence in Darwin is also heavy on symbolism. It is obviously a return of Australian forces to Australia for the first time, land forces after the Second World War. And if you look at the way that the deployment of these forces has received high-level political attention, with, for example, being greeted by the minister, symbolism of this is very, very strong, and is, I think, one of the main reasons why this deployment happened so fast.
Okay, beyond the symbolism, beyond adhering to an alliance, what's in it for Australia?
I think Australia gives support to the US. I think Australia has an interest in the US engaging in this region. Australia has a long-standing interest in the US Australia's interest in the US engaging in this region has been demonstrated in the past through political support, through support in the Middle East. But Australia has also an interest in the US building more links, for example, with Southeast Asia, which is an area where the US had very little presence in recent decades, and in supporting in general the move of the US to engaging, for example, with countries like Singapore, where the US has also decided to station a number of naval ships, with re-engaging with the Philippines, where the US has also increased in recent weeks and months its access rights. And I think that that is something that is remarkable in many ways, given the history. If you look, for example, the Labour Party on the US alliance, but it has bipartisan support. And I think that as a polity, Australia has in many ways taken a very significant decision here.
Stephan, given the economic importance of China to Australia, how great is the risk that this could be perceived by some in Beijing as an attempt to contain China?
I think there is a very real risk that this could be perceived in that way, and I think some of the Chinese comments on these moves definitely demonstrate that. But I think Australia is not alone in that situation. Very similar concerns are raised for all the countries in the region who are seeking to strengthen their links with the US. And I think all countries in the region are walking a fine line between, on the one hand, not wanting the US engaged, but on the other hand, also wanting to maintain very good, close economic and political relations with China. And I think that, therefore, the recent moves that we have seen have been high on symbolism, but actually, if you look at the substance, reasonably limited. We've seen 4 littoral combat ships, which in coming years will be deployed to Singapore, even 2,500 Marines in Darwin in 5 years' time. These numbers are significantly smaller than what we've seen in terms of US deployments to regions like Northeast Asia today, for example, or even Southeast Asia during the Cold War.
Now, history has shown the presence of large numbers of US service personnel here has not always led to harmony. We heard in Hayden Cooper's report before that old adage, overpaid, oversexed and over here. From the Second World War, there was the Battle of Brisbane, the running fights on the streets of Brisbane during the Second World War, the tensions on the streets of Sydney during the Vietnam War. With all of that, how great is the risk of history repeating, and what effect could that potentially have on the two countries' relations?
I think there is. I think there is every possibility that there will be scuffles between American servicemen and Australians. That is not something, but that is something that is quite common. Australian servicemen always, when they deploy overseas, also sometimes behave in a way that one would expect of people often in their age. But I think that the relationship is mature enough that we can deal with these things. I think that there is very little desire in Australia to exploit similar incidents. I think there is very little underlying concern about the relationship in a way that, for example, we sometimes have in Korea or Japan, where, for example, US forces are garrisoned on very large extraterritorial bases. I think the symbolism of the Australia-US relationship is different. I think the relationship is strong enough that those incidents, which I think reasonably have to be expected, will not cause significant ruptures. Given
the eventual deployment number of troops is about 2,500, what's the likelihood then of US bases on Australian soil? I don't think we will ever see US bases on Australian soil, and the Australian governments of both sides of the aisle have always been very careful to make clear that Australia does not want sovereign US bases on Australian territory. I think what we might see is a move to establish a number of additional facilities of the joint facilities. We have, for example, for many decades now had a number of very sensitive communications, intelligence and satellites facilities maintained by the US in Australia, but those are always on joint bases with close Australian engagement in what is going on in those bases. So I think there will not be an American base in Darwin, I think, but I think we will have US forces using ADF facilities. Dr. Stephan Fruehling there in Canberra, I thank you very much for sharing your perspective and time tonight. Good night.